Hi everybody, welcome to Quarantine Movie Club. This week's focus film was Up, and we were, talking about conflict. Talking about the different kinds of conflict this week. And remember, I asked you to find 4 different kinds of conflict, not all 5, because I didn't have all 5 in this particular film. So, I think first we'll go over those types of conflicts. We'll go over those first, and then we'll do our focus questions. Okay, so I'm going to start with man versus man. And we said that didn't have to be an actual man, because my students always were confused with that. It just has to be a character versus another character. So one example of man versus man conflict would be Mr. Fredrickson versus Russell. When Mr. Fredrickson finds that Russell's kind of in his way. He's in the middle of planning his great escape, and Russell is just a wrench in his plan, trying to get his assisting the elderly badge. Blech. But you could also flip that and say that it was Russell against Mr. Fredrickson, because Mr. Fredrickson was keeping Russell from getting the very last badge that he needed for his Wilderness Explorer sash. So it kind of goes both ways. Another example of man versus man conflict would be Mr. Fredrickson versus Charles Muntz, his childhood idol, when he figures out that Charles Muntz is not the great person that he thought he was. So there's a lot of almost internal conflicts tied with that too. He also literally is versus Charles Muntz when he captures the Kevin bird, and Mr. Fredrickson and Russell try to go against him and get the Kevin bird back. Also, Charles Muntz sets his house on fire. Does all kind of terrible things. So next, we will go to man versus nature. Remember, man versus nature is anything that happens naturally. Not anything, there's naturally and then there's supernaturally. Natural is, nature. Supernatural is something you can't control and is not normal. So, a few examples in the first few minutes of the movie. Man versus nature, when his wife either couldn't have children or had a miscarriage or something, there was something wrong with them having children. When she died, that was man versus nature. And the first obstacle in this hero's journey is when the floating house encounters a storm that really helps them in their journey, honestly, because it brings them to Paradise Falls. Exactly where they need to be. The last one I don't really know about this one. What do you guys think? I put Mr. Fredrickson and Russell versus the dogs. The dogs are almost not nature. They're more characters in this film, I think, because they have the voices and they have these personalities. So that one might be a little more man versus man, in my opinion. I don't know. The next one is man versus self. Now this one I have a lot of notes on because this is probably the heavier part of the movie. So I have one example of Mr. Fredrickson trying to decide what to do after he gets news that they're kicking him out of his house. They're building where his house is. They're evicting him. He's getting evicted. He's got to go. So he's faced with a really intense moment of, what do I do? I have to decide now. He also has the internal conflict of how am I going to steer this balloon-powered house? How am I going to take care of this child that has randomly showed up on my floating house? So there's that. There's also it's almost overwhelming feeling of obligation that he has to his wife to fulfill his promise of bringing their house to Paradise Falls. So throughout the whole movie, that is really a big issue. He's like, whatever I'm doing, I need to work towards fulfilling my promise to Ellie. So there's that. I also put an example of when Doug decides to kind of have his own voice and not follow the pack. I think that was a kind of overlooked man versus self conflict in that movie, because Doug, he's not part of the main pack like everybody else is. He doesn't follow Alpha, and he also kind of sticks out on his own anyway. There's a one last example with Russell at the campfire when he talks about, I think he just finally opens up and talks about his issues with his dad and maybe talks about what bothers him, opens up a few things that are really still unsure. But his internal conflict is he doesn't see his dad enough. He wishes that his dad was in his life more. And there's nothing he can do about it because I think he's only like 8 or something. Like, I don't know, he's really young. So the last one, I should have started with this one, but the last one is man versus society. So the best example is when they're kicking Mr. Fredricksen out of his house. 1 second, guys. Get out. The best example is when they do kick him out of his house and tell him, you have to go somewhere else. So that's him versus the people that want to build, him versus the people that want him to go to the nursing home, whatever you would say right there. They offer to pay him double to take his land. I mean, they just try everything to get him off of the land. I also thought it was funny, just a visual of the man versus society. When you look at his front door, he has like 8 different locks on his door. I thought that was funny. And it's like visibly his house is against society. It's the buildings and the businesses are opening around him, and it's just his one house. It's very colorful and bright compared to the gray industrial establishments around him. So I thought that was funny. Man versus society, like he kind of sticks out. But okay. I hope y'all grasp that. I hope y'all. It's kind of late posting. It's kind of late to me. This quarantine's making my sleep schedule whack. Okay, so the focus questions. Number 1, what is Charles Munt's motivation? So I think that his motivation, and we did talk about motivation earlier this year with the Odyssey, his motivation would be to clear his name. Because if you remember correctly, he had this great success in finding the Kevin bird and bringing it back to America and proving himself to be this great explorer and finding all these awesome things at Paradise Falls, but then was later accused of fabricating the bones or the skeletons of these things. So I think that his whole motivation to steal the bird, to harm Mr. Fredricksen and Russell, everything, is so that he can go back and clear his name. So it's purely selfish motivations, like purely selfish reasons. That's it. So he's just out there to take care of himself. Number 2. Why do you think Russell remembers the boring stuff with his dad? And if you remember that scene, he sits around the campfire and he's talking about sitting on the curb and eating ice cream and counting cars. Why do we remember those tiny things? I think it's the tiny things because that is more common maybe, and more, they just stick with us. It's just probably when people are the most genuine, because Russell's dad at that moment when they sit on the curb and they count cars is not trying really hard, is not like showing off anything. Like that is, they're both being as genuine as they possibly can in that really simple, pure moment. And that's why I think he remembers that as opposed to anything more grand or exciting in their relationship, to me. That's my opinion. Number 3. What would Ellie think about Carl's want for isolation? That is the first part. I think she would be extremely disturbed and very disappointed in him. But as you could see in the beginning, he was always kind of quiet and he was always kind of a loner until he met her. So she might not have been very surprised, but I think she would still be disappointed. But it says, second part is, what would she think of his adventure? I do think she would be very, very proud of his adventure and his interactions with the other people and how he progressed as a person through that. I am proud. I think she would be very proud. Okay, number 4. Referring back to our old lessons, how does Mr. Fredricksen change throughout the story? So how does his character develop? Well, I think a very good word to describe him in the beginning would be bitter. He's very bitter and lonely, and he has nothing to do. He has no outlet. throughout the story, he has no choice but to be more patient. He learns patience. He learns perseverance. Like, he had no choice. The balloon is floating in midair. You can't get off. You're stuck with a kid and a bird and a dog. Like, deal with it. So, at the end of the story, I think he's definitely more accepting. He's definitely more patient. He's, I guess, like, there's, like, almost a load lifted off of his shoulders because he had fulfilled his promise to Ellie and probably got some closure with that and was able to move on and build new relationships and finally let her go when he let the house go. And last but not least, number 5, what is the overall theme or main idea of this film, of this movie? So the one I found was, you're never too old to fulfill a dream. Like, a dream is never too old to come true. And it's so wholesome and so positive because I think that if he would have went into the nursing home, he never would have had that opportunity to go to Paradise Falls. So he kind of took it when he had the chance, and he did it, and he didn't regret it. Although it was painful, although it was full of excitement and other things, it was definitely worth it. So I think he learned a lot from his adventure. He definitely changed. He made new relationships that he was missing out on because of his wife's death. So, on a lighter note, we're going to try to do Point of View next week with The Emperor's New Groove. So that'll be interesting. Can't wait. See you guys next week.